As usual, Satchel yelled at him to go away, but on this morning Woody grabbed him by the leg and started twisting it. "I'm going to break your fucking leg," he said, and I really thought he would. Satchel screamed in pain. Dylan screamed. I flew over to the bed and pulled Woody off him. In vain I had tried to promote a better relationship between Woody and Satchel. When Woody took Dylan off into other rooms, I would mime, "Take Satchel, too." When he brought Dylan a present, I would ask that he would bring one for Satchel, and for Moses, too. I pointed out Satchel's many accomplishments and interests, and I suggested ways that Woody might become involved with him. But eventually I realized that he was not withholding his affection. It simply did not exist for Satchel or Moses or any of the other children. Lightning would not strike twice in our family. Woody would love one child only, and his love for her was an unusual kind. In the spring of 1991, I was told about an orphaned 6-year-old boy in Vietnam. He was unable to walk because of polio, they said, and had been in an orphanage all his life. It seemed an omen to me, a post-polio child who needed a home. Woody was far less opposed to the idea of adopting this child than he had been to the adoption of Dylan. In fact, when pictures of the boy arrived that May, we looked at them together and noted that in 4 of the 5 snapshots, a girl was standing next to the boy, a girl of about 10 or 12 who was obviously blind. Woody commented on how pretty she was and said, "If it's not a big deal, why don't you see if you can get the girl, too?" You could have knocked me down with a feather. I hugged him tight. "Really?" was all I could say. "Really?" "You might as well," he said, hugging me back. "I'm not a bad guy." It turned out that the little girl had been in the Vietnamese orphanage for 6 years. Her name was Tam. I began the paperwork for both children. That June, Lark and Suni graduated from their high schools. Woody surprised all of us by showing up at Suni's graduation. Both young women had been accepted at the colleges of their choice, Lark at New York University and Suni at Drew University. They were beautiful and polar opposites. Lark, all passion, generosity, love, and laughter, had always been in so many ways the heart of the family. Even the parrot Edna would call, "Lark, Lark." I doubt if in her life she has gone through a single waking hour of any day without trying to do something for somebody else. Suni was quiet, reserved, and cautious. Dr. Audrey Seeger, whose doctorate is in learning and reading disabilities, had tutored her from the 6th grade through the 12th. She's a very typical learning disabled kid, very socially inappropriate, very, very naive, said Dr. Seeger. She has trouble understanding language on an inferential level. She's very literal and flat in how she interprets what she sees and how she interprets things socially. She misinterprets situations. During those last 6 months of high school, there was a definite change. In the summer of 1991, Woody and I took the whole family, minus Matthew, Sasha, and Suni, who had jobs in New York, and we drove around the west of Ireland for a couple of weeks. I'd always told Woody he'd like it there, and he did. After the trip, the kids and I returned to Frog Hollow while, in the city, Woody prepared husbands and wives. The younger children and I missed the older kids, who were home less and less, but everybody came up to Frog Hollow with Woody on the weekends. I was proud of the young adults they had become, and I loved their company. The twins were 21 and had both been doing well at top colleges. That summer Sasha was managing a city store, while Matthew was working for the ACLU. Both boys had wonderful partners of long standing who by then were practically family members, and they were looking out for Suni, who had a job at Bergdorf Goodman. In August, Woody again brought up the subject of adopting Dylan. He and his lawyers had a new idea, one they hoped would be effective. If he were to adopt Moses, the only other child in the family who had no father, his petition would be much stronger. At 13, Moses could be articulate in his wish for a father. Moses would piggyback Dylan's adoption, Woody said. He had now been trying to adopt Dylan for about 3 years. I doubted it would ever happen, but ever since Moses had been a tiny child, he had wished for Woody to be his father. It was his dream. Even if it never got to court, it would mean the world to him that Woody had tried. We called Moses into the living room and asked if he would like Woody to be his father. Moses just lit up. He smiled and smiled for days. Later that same September, I traveled to Vietnam to bring home the 2 new children. My friend Casey, her husband Jack Pascal, and 3.5-year-old Satchel accompanied me on the 11-day journey. Woody was adamant that Dylan, now 6, should not be taken out of school, but he was very supportive about the trip and about the new kids. He even tried to coax a film studio to provide a jet for the trip, and when that fell through, he offered to help me pay for it. I worried about leaving Dylan, but Lark and Sasha would be staying at the apartment to babysit, along with Fletcher and Daisy, who were 17. Suni promised to come home from college in nearby New Jersey every weekend. I also had a babysitter I trusted, the therapist was in place, and over Woody promised he would remember not to let things get too much. In the rice paddies near Bavi, the midday heat pressed heavily on the countryside. An old woman looked up from her work to stare at the time travelers as we streaked rudely past. I lifted a little boy out of a crib which he shared with another child of roughly the same size, whose wrist was tied with a knotted rag to the rusted bars. There was no mattress. The children sat on sagging wooden slats without blankets or sheets. The walls were pitted and stained, and the windows had no glass. I opened a suitcase full of toys from the Danbury Mall and passed out the little cars, rocket ships and airplanes, Power Rangers, crayons, pads of colored paper, bubbles and dolls, to the thin, ragged children, their eyes alight. Almost immediately, a woman moved quietly behind them, taking their toys, putting them into her upturned straw hat. Forget it, I was told. She will take the toys home to her own kids. I asked for the little girl, Nguyen Thi Tam, but was told that she had been moved to an institution for the blind. Her papers were not complete, so she wouldn't be able to leave with me after all. It seemed that people there, 3 hours outside of Hanoi, had not seen too many blue-eyed, white-haired 3-year-olds. Satchel was an attraction, and everybody wanted to touch his hair. Later, in Hanoi, a ragged boy of about 9 ran along the sidewalk bare-legged, with a small child wearing a newspaper hat tied to his chest, asleep against his shoulder. The streets were a wild jumble of bicycles, pedal rickshaws, and people on their haunches in clusters, cooking, eating, and talking. A mirror nailed to a tree served as a barber shop. Houses left by the French crumbled elegantly in bleached colors under the hot sun, and laundry hung from windows. A sheet of canvas or plastic supported by poles was roof enough for a shop, a restaurant, or a home. These ticky-tacky appendages added a lively look. I was taken to see Nguyen Thi Tam, who recoiled from the stuffed bear I had brought for her. The workers explained that she thought the bear was real. When she was taken away after less than 10 minutes, I wondered if I would ever see her again. By chance, Mother Teresa was also having breakfast one morning in the dining room of the Hanoi government guest house, unruffled by the giant rats that zigzagged across the room and under the tables. I all but genuflected when she said, "God bless you," just as she had in New York in the early 80s, when I had brought the kids to the United Nations to see a documentary on her life and to meet her. She was the embodiment of everything I had tried to teach them about true success and what one person with conviction and courage can accomplish. As we spoke in Hanoi, I recalled how Matthew, Sasha, Suni, Lark, Fletcher, Daisy, and I had stood in line for our chance to meet her, and then I had run around to the end of the line to do it again. Michael Douglas and his lovely wife were standing next to Mother Teresa, so I met them twice, too. My initial policy in Hanoi was to eat whatever was served if it didn't have a fly on it at the moment I saw it, and if I could identify it generically, but I loosened up on both points. I gave Satchel only the food we had brought with us in cans, jars, bottles, and packages, because who knew, and because he had his own rigid food policies. We kept his stuff in the little refrigerator in our room. Once I left the grape jelly out, and within 20 minutes insects were marching in an organized line from the window across the floor, up the refrigerator, and swarming the sealed jelly jar. Bathroom bugs came in 3 varieties: little black hurriers, laid-back centipedes, and huge, disgusting, fleshy ones, possibly of the water bug family. Whenever I went into the bathroom, I would first make a lot of noise, clapping hands, stamping feet, or singing loudly to send them scurrying. There weren't enough analysts in the world to have gotten Woody through this trip, but Satchel could not have been more thrilled. I'd go so far as to say that the bugs made the whole adventure for him, and I thought of how Moses would have loved it there. As I shampooed lice off the little boy's head, I saw that his back was humped, and his limbs were quite shriveled. He could not move his legs. Although I had been told that he'd had polio, I'd seen enough of that disease to doubt it, nor did it seem to be cerebral palsy, since his muscles were flaccid, not contracted, and even given the incalculable deprivations of his circumstances, this 6-year-old boy did not appear to be functioning normally. I brought my concerns to the head of the Hanoi-based American Adoption Agency, and I told her we needed to have the child evaluated before I went further. On the forms she'd originally sent to me, there were lists with boxes to check: acceptable, not acceptable, and willing to discuss. In the not acceptable category, I had made only 2 checks: profound retardation and degenerative illnesses. While considering the adoption of a child with special needs, I had concluded, out of fairness to my existing family, that any child who joined us should one day be able to live independently. It didn't seem right that a decision of mine should knowingly present a burden to the other children. In Hanoi, the head of the agency admitted that the boy had never been examined by any medical person, and said that I wouldn't find competent doctors there. She recommended I take him to Bangkok. We did that, and in the hospital, English-speaking doctors confirmed that it was not polio, but some other thing that had caused his condition. The possibilities included degenerative muscular diseases. Further diagnosis would take weeks. Worried, exhausted, and in a quandary, Casey and I called Woody from the hotel in Bangkok to explain the situation. He advised us to bring the boy back and have him thoroughly tested in the United States. The agency agreed. They said that if the problems turned out to be more complex than I felt we could handle, they already knew of an excellent family in the United States who couldn't afford to travel or to pay the fees, but who were looking for just such a child. When we got him home, testing revealed that the boy was afflicted with a rare type of cerebral palsy, and that he was functioning at the level of a 16-month-old. He screamed through much of the day and night. In family conversations that included Woody, we decided that the boy's retardation would present overwhelming and ongoing problems for the younger children particularly. So after only 5 traumatic, heartbreaking days in our home, he left to join his forever family. In the quiet, after his departure, the children and I talked about how he would be with good people where his needs would be well met. Things don't always turn out the way we hope. God has his own plans. But our role in the boy's life had been an important one. We had helped him along the journey to his permanent home. Meanwhile, we were told that Tam would join us at Christmas time. I had scarcely recovered from that experience when we began shooting Husbands and Wives, my 13th film with Woody. He was already busy firing a young actress when I began to focus on the film and learn my lines. He sent me to a noon showing of Cape Fear to see whether I thought Juliette Lewis could play his college girl flirtation. I returned raving about Ms. Lewis, and she got the job. Sidney Pollack and Judy Davis were also in the movie, and Liam Neeson, who became my friend. Woody now seemed preoccupied and cold, and he was still tired all the time. When I tried to discuss what could be wrong, he talked about Lyme disease and chronic fatigue syndrome and how he had to get tested for HIV. "How could you possibly have that?" I asked. "We've been together for nearly a dozen years." He answered that there was a long incubation period for HIV. "Then get the test," I urged. "You've spent a whole year worrying. This is no way to live. You don't have it. You'll be so relieved when you get the news that it'll be like a new life. Please do it." He was tested around the time of his 56th birthday, and the results came back negative. Then news of another kind increased his happiness. The surrogate's court had agreed to let him adopt my children, Dylan and Moses. Although Woody's behavior with Dylan was not yet on course, I believed he would continue to work on it in good faith.